you so much, Laura. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. I am joining from Austin, Texas. So it is actually 8:15 here. I've tried to do my best with lighting, so hopefully it holds up. But if I start to look a little bit like I'm in the shadows, that's just because I'm 2 hours ahead of y'all in Oregon. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Let me do that. Great. And Laura, can you just give me a yes that you can see my screen share?
Looks good.
Okay, perfect. Great. So I am Dr. Pooja Lakshmin. I am a board certified psychiatrist, the founder and CEO of Gemma, and the author of the new book, Real Self-Care, Crystals, Cleanses, and Bubble Baths Not Included. And we're going to be talking today, we're going to be spending about an hour and a half together talking about real self-care. And I am super, super excited. I do have to just give some disclaimers. I'm used to this from doing medical CME, and I assumed it was the same thing with educator CME. Everything that we're talking about today is education only. It's not medical advice. I'm a doctor. I'm not your doctor. I have a bunch of different places that I work and ways that I make money. I have a private practice. I'm on the faculty at George Washington University in DC. I do a bunch of media and consulting work, and I do have this education platform, Gemma. And I'm going to actually just remind myself in real time that Martin is translating into Spanish. And so I'm going to try and speak slowly and enunciate and try not to speed through. So if I'm speaking a little bit slower, that's why, because there's another conversation happening at the same time in Spanish, which is just an amazing thing. And I'm really glad that we have this resource. So I like to start off my talks with giving all of you a sense of my professional background and also my personal story. Because both are equally as important to this work of real self-care. In today's presentation, I'm going to be sharing with you all the difference between faux self-care and real self-care. And my conceptualization of this framework is not only coming from a professional basis and expertise, but it's also coming from my own lived experience. So on the professional side, like I mentioned, I'm a psychiatrist. I specialize in women's mental health. I have a private practice, and I also do some academic work at George Washington University. I have this women's mental health platform that I founded in 2020. I do a lot of education and advocacy work through writing for places like the New York Times. And then I just wrote my first book in March that just came out. And in today's conversation, I'm going to be teaching the tools that I share in the book. But my personal story, again, just as important, is that about a decade ago, I was in my late 20s, and up until that point, I had kind of followed all the rules. I am the daughter of South Asian immigrant parents, and I was a good Indian girl. I got into Ivy League schools, became a doctor, got married, sort of did everything that I was supposed to do. And when I was 28, found myself saying, okay, now that I've checked all the boxes, now that I've done everything I'm supposed to, I guess now I can figure out how to be happy. And I didn't know how to be happy because I had constructed my whole life based on other people's values. Not that those values were bad or wrong. My immigrant parents sacrificed so much so that I could have the education that I did, that I had the opportunities that I did. But I had never spent any time really doing the internal work of real self-care to know what was most important to me. So even though I had all this external success, it felt really, really empty on the inside. So I kind of blew up my life. I left my marriage. I moved into a wellness commune in San Francisco. I pretty quickly after that dropped out of my residency program. And I spent 2 years going really deep into what I call the woo-woo wellness world. And that's one of the reasons that the subtitle of this book is Crystals, Cleanses, and Bubble Baths Not Included. Because at the end of that 2 years, I learned that there is no shortcut. Anybody that is trying to tell you that they have the answer, that they have the path, they have the new diet, they have the new exercise program, that this is it, this is going to be the thing. It's not going to be the thing, because there's not one thing. There's actually many, 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 many hundreds and thousands of things in the form of small, hard decisions that you have to make in your own life. And so this was way back in 2013. And I was fortunate. I spent 2 years with this group and ultimately I left the group. I came back to medicine, finished my training, came on the faculty at GW. But when I came back to medicine, I came back as a very different person. I came back knowing that I was going to hold on to myself and I wasn't going to martyr myself anymore to this oppressive system that had sort of destroyed me, really. In 2018, I found out through the media, I found out that this group actually was a cult. So I write about it a bit more in Real Self-Care, sort of my journey, but that, kind of coming to terms with all of this and then unpacking why it happens, but also really putting forward what we can be doing instead of these quick fixes, because the quick fixes are failing us. And also because I have compassion for the people that turn to them, because it's not out of stupidity or, naivete that folks turn to the quick fixes. It's because the structures around us are so broken that that oftentimes we feel so hopeless that those quick fixes feel like they could be a life raft. And so in today's presentation, I'm going to be sharing my framework for what real sustainable life rafts are in real self-care. And hopefully this will give you some food for thought to think about a new conceptualization of wellness, a new conceptualization of how you take care of yourself and make space for your own well-being. I don't propose to have all the answers. Today's talk is about starting a new conversation with yourself. Yes, I'm a psychiatrist, and yes, I have all this training, but I don't know each person's answer on this call. I just know sort of different questions that maybe you could ask yourself. So our agenda for today, I will be honest that it is an expansive and grandiose agenda, but we're going to do it. We're going to do it together. So our first 50 minutes together, I'm going to be teaching you about what faux self-care is and about what real self-care is. And I'm going to go through the 4 principles of real self-care, and included in that are going to be tips and takeaways that you can use. Then we'll have about 10 minutes for QA. And if you have a burning question, feel free to put it in the chat. We'll come back to it during the QA. If it's something that is very, very burning and needs to be addressed right away, Laura will interrupt me, and I can address it as I'm speaking in these in the first portion of our time together. Then we will take a short break, and then after that, we have about 25 minutes for a facilitated discussion. I have a couple prompts to guide that discussion, and I'm hoping that we can all have our videos on and talk and chat, and I can answer questions and we can have a conversation during that time. I'm going to stop here because I have a couple poll questions that I was hoping Laura could pull up. Laura, do I need to stop my screen share? Oh no, they're coming up. Great. Okay. So I'm curious what wellness activities folks on the call have tried. All right, so I'm seeing got nearly everybody coming in with their responses. Give it another couple seconds to get the stragglers. Okay. So we're at, let's see, we're about almost 20% with yoga, another 20% with meditation, close to 20% with massages, closer to 10% with diet or supplements, and then another 30% with other. So it's safe to say that nearly everybody on the call has tried prescribed, consumer-oriented, focused wellness activities. All right, can we move to the next question? Okay, perfect. So for this one, I want you to think about, when are you most likely to turn to wellness? Is it after a long day at work? Is it after a conflict with a partner or a colleague? Is it when you're feeling stuck about a situation in your life, like something that you don't quite know how to solve and that's really distressing you? Or is it when you have extra time, when you have extra energy, when you're generally feeling good, that you go to wellness? And if you notice, those first three answers are more along the lines of, I'm feeling bad and then I turn to wellness, versus that last one is, I'm feeling good and I turn to wellness. Okay, so we've got close to everybody responding. So let me share. So it looks like almost 50% of people are coming to wellness actually when they feel good, which is interesting, right? And then the other 50% of folks are coming to wellness after a hard day at work, or when they're having a hard time or feeling stuck. So these are data points for you to think about as you're sort of assessing for yourself, what does wellness do for you? What are you using it for? Is it helpful? Is it not helpful? And then there's one last poll question. What aspect of traditional wellness, and when I say traditional, I mean, I should have said consumer-oriented wellness, has you feeling most disappointed? And the options are that I never have time for it, that the effects aren't long-lasting, that it's too expensive, or that it makes me feel guilty for not doing it enough. And then other. And I will say that for this one, if you have more than one answer that fits, just pick the one that applies more frequently for you. Okay, great. So got nearly everyone's answer. And so for this last question, it's a pretty decently even split. Let's see. Never have time is most common. Feeling guilty for not doing it enough, that it's expensive, and the effects aren't long lasting. So, and these are very common responses. This is exactly what I see in my clinical practice. So I would like to reassure all of you that all of these feelings and thoughts about wellness are completely normal. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Lara, for running those polls. And let's see, how do I back out of this? There we go. Okay, thanks for bearing with me, guys. Okay, so hopefully the questions that I asked in the polls give you a sense of what is broken about wellness. And, you know, when Oregon State reached out to me to give this presentation, my first response was like, yes, absolutely. Early childhood educators, teachers, caregivers of young kids, you are the folks that need this information the most. As I was researching for this talk, I came across so much data and so much information that speaks to the specific plight of early childhood educators and folks that are working in early childhood settings. Even though the type of person that goes into this work is hugely mission and goal oriented, the type of people that decide to work in early childhood education are folks who are service oriented and mission oriented. The conditions, the working conditions in most early childhood spaces and centers, and the resources available are hugely variable, and in many, many parts of the country, very underfunded. And so as an early childhood educator, and I know many of you on the call are also parents yourself, you're balancing at least two, perhaps more, depending on your intersectional identities, two incredibly burdensome and undervalued roles in your life and in your professional career as well. And so this data is coming from 0 to 3, which looked at this, has done a ton of research, as I'm sure many of you know, on the working conditions and the stressors for early childhood educators. And this term triple jeopardy was a new term to me, although I'm sure many of you on this call have are well versed in it. But the specific phenomenon of working with young children that are exposed to their own trauma adds to the pre-existing poor well-being and difficult working conditions for early childhood educators. So you're really in a tough spot, and working on the front lines, especially as we've seen during the pandemic, really the front lines for the most vulnerable folks in America, you know, children, right? So this is sort of the context that I'm coming to this talk with, which is that all of you here are service providers, you're mission oriented, you're in this work because something about your values really speaks to working with the most vulnerable people, and your entire professional environment is under-resourced, underfunded, and in some cases under attack too, depending on the political environment that you're in. So that comes to the topic of burnout. And I'm sure many of you have, read about burnout, I'm sure many of you on this call might have experienced or are experiencing burnout as we speak. A big part of my work and in what I'm teaching in real self-care is the understanding that burnout isn't the right word for what teachers, healthcare providers, early childhood educators, parents, mothers, you name the role, what those folks are feeling. Because burnout still puts the onus of change on the individual. But the reason for all of these problems actually falls on our social structures. So if we're talking about social structures, we live in a country where 30 million Americans don't have health insurance, where 25% of American workers aren't able to take a paid sick day. Or if you're a Black woman in America, you have to work for 19 months to make the same amount of money that a white man would make in 12 months, right? Those are all outcomes that are the result of systemic forces like white supremacy, like patriarchy, like end stage capitalism. And we as individuals, our workers, humans, are influenced by these larger constructs. And something like burnout is an end human response to a social structure that has deeply failed the folks who are inside that structure. And so when I wrote this article for the New York Times, this was in 2021. And I was writing it from my perspective as a perinatal psychiatrist. I work with women and folks who identify as women, mostly mothers. And so I was writing it to speak to the plight of women who worked outside the home during the height of the pandemic and who were trying to balance the impossible. And I imagine many of you as early childhood educators and workers who also might be parents yourselves during the height of the pandemic were balancing all of this too. But I don't think that it's only applicable to mothers or parents. I think that it's applicable to really anybody who is in the service industry or doing care work. And when I say care work, I mean the invisible emotional labor that goes on in the type of job that all of you have, where you're working with vulnerable kids, with kids who have experienced trauma, with kids who are under-resourced and are inside systems where they don't have access to get their needs met. You're constantly bumping up against these oppressive systems, and that is what is causing the hurts and the quote unquote burnout. So then we come to wellness, right? And this is what I'm talking about in real self-care, the faux self-care. It's the patient who comes in and says to me, well, Dr. Lakshmin, I'm not eating well, I'm not sleeping well, and I feel like it's my fault because I have this meditation app on my phone that I know I'm supposed to be using. And so, like we just talked about earlier in the poll questions, I think the most common response to my answer of what's most disappointing about wellness was that you don't have time to get to any of the things. You don't have time to go to yoga. You don't have time to meditate after you get through a whole workday where you're doing all of this care work. And then you come home and maybe you're responsible for your own kids, or maybe you're responsible for your sister's kids, or maybe you're responsible for your aging parents, or you have a partner who has chronic illness, right? And so you're probably doing more care work then when you come home. And then in maybe the 20 or 30 minutes between everybody going to bed and you passing out because you're so exhausted, the last thing that you want to do is meditate or do yoga, right? All you want to do is just kind of doom scroll. because you feel like a zombie. And again, the reason for that is because of this systemic betrayal, not because you don't have enough willpower to learn how to meditate. So in Real Self-Care, I quote Audre Lorde, I think about 4 times over the course of the book. And that is intentional because this work of self-care, it was actualized into public discourse from Black queer thinkers like Audre Lorde and bell hooks. And so Audre Lorde said, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." I'm just going to read it one more time because it's just so powerful, and I really want all of you to sort of just soak it in. "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." And so what I'm saying with Real Self-Care is that we need an internal solution. This can't be about playing the same game, because when you're playing the same game, the house always wins, right? So that's why real self-care can't be something that you buy. It actually has to come from inside of you. Real self-care lives in your decisions. It's in the hundreds and thousands of choices that you make every day, the small choices and the big choices. So the big choices like, do I want to have kids? Do I want to have a life partner? Who do I choose as my life partner? What is my career going to be? Where do I want to live? You know, when I ask these questions, my patients are just like, "Dr. Lakshmin, it's like 10 in the morning. Like, please, like, just let me live. Like, why?" and I'm just like, I know those are hard questions, and answering those questions in alignment with your values is real self-care. And I know that that sounds overwhelming, and that's why I've created 4 principles. The principles of real self-care are the way that you answer those questions for yourself. So there's 4 principles, and we're going to dive into each one. The first is setting boundaries. The second is compassion. The third is values, bringing yourself closer to yourself through your values. And then the last is asserting your power and understanding that this process of internal change and deliberate decision-making is actually an assertion of power. And it's the way that you get yourself back in the face of oppressive systems. So the first principle is boundaries. And I have here on this side, guilt does not need to be your compass. Let me give you an example of how I imagine that boundaries might show up in an early childhood educator environment, which I will add is quite similar, I imagine, to a healthcare provider environment because of the structures and the way that things are structured and the enormity of the responsibility that you guys all take on in your work. So the way that boundaries comes up is, let's say that you, it's a holiday week and everybody is really stressed. It's a busy time of year, and somebody on your team is really sick and can't come in. And they're really, really sick. And your manager calls and says, "Hey, Pooja, Susan called out. She's really not feeling well. We really need somebody else in the infant classroom. Please, can you come do it?" And this is a week that you had taken off. You had plans with your family, like it was really important to you and you were looking forward to it. that's where your boundaries come in, right? Because you are going to feel guilty, but the work of setting boundaries is in understanding that you always have a choice. I forgot to mention as I started this talk that I have a 1-year-old son who currently is in, who just transitioned from the infant room to the young toddler room. This transition is actually happening this week right now. It's been a little bit of a rough week because he's going through that transition. It's been a little tough one, but so that's why I had the infant room at the tip of my tongue. But that's the perfect example, right? You get called in for something that was not supposed to be on your plate and you were supposed to have rest time, and then you feel guilty, you feel bad. So what do you do? So first, I have a couple scripts here. This is a great slide to screenshot. It has some literal scripts that you can use. If you're somebody who has not incorporated boundaries into your vocabulary and your language, it's really, really helpful to have scripts that you can use either over text message or email or even in conversation. The other two concepts that I want to share, and I frame these as life rafts, right? So when we're in that space of burnout and drowning, these are our life rafts. We need these specific tools, these skills to start practicing so that we can survive, right? Because when you're in that burnout place, you really do feel like you're drowning. And so when it comes to boundaries and the skill of learning boundaries, there's two specific life rafts that I like. The first is the pause. So I learned the pause back in 2016. I had just graduated psychiatry residency at GW, George Washington University, and my mentor took me out for lunch. And it was my first day on the job. And she gave me a really surprising piece of advice. She said, Pooja, you don't need to answer your phone. You can just let it go to voicemail and listen to what they want and then decide how to answer. And that was like super shocking to me because I had just finished medical school and residency. And in those days, this is really dating me, but we had like pagers that you would get paged and you had to answer right away. And it was like this hyper vigilant response. So for my mentor to be like, Pooja, you don't have to answer your phone, I was like, what? That is like, this is crazy. But then it hit me, oh, like your boundary is in the pause. So you pause and you wait, and then you can say yes, you can say no, or you can negotiate. So a boundary isn't always a no, it's the pause. And the no is also not always accessible, depending on your social determinants of health, depending on how much money you have, how much savings you have, whether you have childcare yourself, the color of your skin, right? Your gender identity, all these different things. The no might be too costly for you. By costly, I mean financially or emotionally. But the pause is always available. And if the no is not an option, then you can say to yourself, okay, I recognize that I want to be able to say no to this, but it's too costly right now. So my strategic self-care work is a year for a year from now to be closer to being able to say no than I am right now. And it might take you a whole year to get to being closer to the no. And that's why there's a part 2 of this session where we're going to be talking about building your real self-care compass. I think of that as your swim to shore plan. So right now we're talking about life rafts. We're talking about you're burnt out and you just need these immediate tools and skills that will help you tread water and just feel like you're getting this bit of relief. Ultimately, we want to build our compass, which is the swim to shore plan. And so we'll talk about that next session. But the pause is one of my favorite life rafts when it comes to boundaries. And then the second one, this is a phrase to incorporate into your thinking. I am not my thoughts. So for example, with guilt, right? That's the thing that comes up first and foremost when you start saying no, you feel guilty. And my patients are always like, Dr. Lakshmin, it's fine. Like setting boundaries is fine, whatever. But like, I don't want to feel guilty. I hate feeling guilty. And the problem is that, this is bad news. You can't get rid of the guilt because the guilt isn't actually yours. The guilt is internalized stigma from the systems of oppression that we talked about earlier, from white supremacy, from patriarchy, from capitalism, right? Capitalism runs on the guilt of millions and millions of American workers. So the solve for that, the life raft for that, is to remember that you are not your thoughts. Guilt doesn't need to be your moral compass. And instead, I think of guilt as a faulty check engine light, like on your car, on the dashboard. It's like you've gotten the oil changed, you've got it serviced, everything's fine. Nothing's wrong, but the stupid check engine light, it just keeps going off. It's not giving you any valuable information. It's just going off. It's broken. And that's what guilt is. It's just there, but doesn't need to control you. So the solution is not to avoid guilt. The solution is to practice turning the volume down so it's not the primary driver of your decision-making. So principle 2 of real self-care is self-compassion. And the reason for this is because first, you have to set your boundaries to be able to energetically make some space for yourself and understand that you and your needs are distinct from your partner's needs, from your kids' needs, from the kids at school, from the parents at school, right? You have to make that space for yourself. And then comes self-compassion. And it's funny, when I first started writing Real Self-Care, I was the type of person that sort of rolled my eyes at self-compassion. I felt like it was a very like woo-woo type of thing. I I always think about that 30 Rock episode where Jack's mom had died, and he's sharing about how on her deathbed she was like, well, I just wanted you to be happy. And he viewed that as like, oh no, she thought I was failing. She thought there's no hope for me because now all she wants for me is to be happy, like as if that meant he was a failure. That was my mindset, which it was not a good mindset. But the thing is, self-compassion, it's not about like the crystals or the woo-woo or like the affirmations. It's just about how you talk to yourself, like how you have conversations with yourself, because we're all constantly in an internal dialogue. And one tool that can help with reminding yourself that this is an ongoing internal conversation and that compassion is about the conversation, it's called the sushi train, and it comes from ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. And there's a great YouTube video that is linked here on the slides that we can share with everybody after the session that I highly recommend. And it goes through this metaphor, but basically the metaphor is to imagine that you're at a sushi restaurant, the type where the plates of sushi are coming off the conveyor belt, and the sous chef at the center is making all the pieces of sushi. So the sous chef is your brain, and the sushi in this metaphor is all of the different thoughts and feelings and desires that you have. And some of those things are going to be really yummy, right? They're going to be like the spicy tuna roll, which I love, and you just want to like grab it and shove it down your mouth. Other things are going to be kind of gross looking. I am not a fan of shrimp with their head on. It really grosses me out. I don't like eels, right? Those are plates of sushi that I want to be like, let me push that away. The practice is to just let the conveyor belt move by. When you're getting stuck in negative thinking, when you're berating yourself for being a bad mom, a bad teacher, a bad parent, think about the sushi train and just let those thoughts go by. You don't need to pick up the plate. You don't need to eat it. You also don't need to shove it away. You can just let it pass because no thought or feeling is forever. There's a couple other compassion life rafts that I want to make sure to share with you. So the first is naming your inner critic. So like I said, with self-compassion, we're all having conversations with ourselves constantly. And the work of self-compassion is to have a nice conversation with yourself, as opposed to a cruel or a mean conversation with yourself. And that voice, the one that is sort of like a taskmaster or is kind of like driving you really hard, that is what we call the inner critic. And one way to dial in on compassion is actually to name your inner critic and naming it something silly. So my inner critic, for example, is Angelica from Rugrats, the cartoon from Nickelodeon. She is the really bossy, mean older sister. And that's what my inner critic sounds like, right? She's terrible. But putting that picture of Angelica on that voice helps me to remember that that's not actually me. One of my patients named her inner critic the Anna Wintour character from The Devil Wears Prada, Miranda Priestley, which I thought was just such a great characterization of an inner critic. And then the second life raft here is connecting to good enough. So especially for folks who are working in a caretaking profession, like all of you, as we talked about, you're people who come to early childhood educator work because you're mission driven, because you want to serve, because you want to work with vulnerable people. There's often this fear of being selfish. There's a fear of being selfish, and there is a desire to put selfless on a pedestal. The reality is that there's a middle path that is good enough. And so in that good enough place, you're not selfish and you're not selfless. You're saying, I'm part of the team too. I'm allowed to make choices that I'm allowed to take myself into account in the choices that I'm making. And I'm not saying that you will forever, I'm not saying that every single choice will prioritize you, because of course not. We all live in a world where we have to pay bills, we have to get things done, we have people that we're responsible for. What I'm saying is that maybe 1 in 5 choices centers you, or has you at least in the top 3. So many of my patients say that they feel like they're managing their families, but they don't feel like they're actually part of the family. And so when I'm talking about good enough, what I'm saying is that like you're on the team too. You're allowed to be on the team. The team wants you on the team, right? So so that's another place where you can really lean into the self-compassion. I know we started a couple of minutes late, and I am going to try and wrap up here in about 5 minutes. So we can get to QA and also have time for our discussion, which I think will be very juicy too. So the crux of real self-care centers on principle 3, which is getting clear on your values and meaning-centered well-being. In our second session, we'll be digging into what's called the real self-care compass. That is a tool to help you identify your values and also to help you execute on making choices that are aligned with your values. This is all based on the concept of eudaimonic well-being. Eudaimonic well-being is an evidence-based type of well-being that says people are healthier physically and mentally when your behavior is aligned with what matters most to you. The more time you spend in a day with people that you really care about, doing activities that are meaningful and that you've named and identified for yourself why they are meaningful, that leads to a healthy, fulfilling life. Again, nobody has the option of spending 100% of their time on ultra meaningful tasks. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that real self-care is about optimizing and having it be that, let's say, 70% of your time in any given week is spent with people or activities that feel connected to what means the most to you. Now, in order to make those choices, you have to be able to set boundaries and you have to be able to speak to yourself with compassion. I'm going to just cover here the first concept, and then in our next talk later in June, I'll go into the dinner party since we're running short on time. So one of the life rafts here, because sometimes when I talk about values, people look at me with very blank faces. I can't see all of your faces right now, so I'm not sure how many folks are blanking out. But when I talk about values, sometimes people get a little bit angry because they're kind of like, well, Pooja, don't you know how much I'm doing every day? Don't you see how much is on my to-do list? Like, I'm drowning. I don't have time to think about what really matters. Sort of like, how dare you ask me to think about that? And I get that. You know, when you're burnt out, when you're in that drowning place, it can feel very risky to even let yourself dream of what you might want or what you might really find to be fulfilling or valuable. So I would say, so that's why when we're talking about life rafts, the exercise here or the tool here is like, if you're one of those people that did say yes to wellness activities, if you do go to yoga, if you do meditate, if you do have these things that you do, can you bring some of your values to that wellness practice? So sometimes I work with folks who are very competitive with their wellness, or their wellness is very performance oriented. And so let's say that one of your values, let's say that you're running a marathon, and that's something that's important to you. It's your wellness activity, and you find yourself becoming very obsessive and like tracking your running times, and you have your whole spreadsheet, and right, it's like this whole thing. And if you miss a day, you're beating yourself up. Well, then I would say to you, okay, like, let's look more closely at why you even got into running in the first place. And maybe it might turn out that the reason that you got into running is because you wanted to make sure you were taking care of yourself so that you could be physically active well into your 60s and 70s. So you could run around with your kids, right? It actually doesn't really matter too much if you can run a marathon or what your marathon time is, right? So like getting clear on like what actually brought you to those wellness activities, and then naming those values and bringing it back to how you're performing that wellness now. The last principle of real self-care is power, remembering that you have power. So this quote from Bell Hooks: sometimes people try to destroy you precisely because they recognize your power, not because they don't see it, but because they see it and they don't want it to exist. So I want to give an example from the book as I'm wrapping up here of power and what I mean by power. So I had a patient who, she originally came to me for treatment of her depression, her anxiety, which we got under control with therapy and medication. And then we started doing some of this more difficult real self-care work, starting to set boundaries, asking these questions of what really mattered to her. And what we uncovered was that she was actually quite angry at her husband. They had 2 kids, and he had never taken a paternity leave. He worked for small startups, and he never felt like it was worth that he could risk asking for it. He felt guilty to leave all that work to the rest of the team, et cetera, et cetera. And her real self-care process, the boundaries, the compassion, the getting clear on what was valuable to her, led her to having some hard conversations with him. She got pregnant with her 3rd baby, and she said, I really need you to ask for paternity leave. They might say no, but I need to know that you're willing to take the risk and ask. And he did ask, and they said yes. And that change went on to impact everybody else at that company and all the future employees too. And so my patient was not trying to be an advocate or an activist. She was just trying not to hate her husband and not get divorced, but it led to systemic change. And that's the thing with real self-care. When you start working through these principles, it's not going to happen overnight. No, and it's not even going to happen in a month. It's probably going to take years, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. That actually means that it's sustainable and it's coming from you. There's a cascade effect, and that's where the power comes in. Because like Audre Lorde said, right, the master's tools can't fix this solution. They'll just rebuild the same house. So we have to use different tools, and these tools have to be internal. So when it comes to power, hope is the thing that is so important, because especially in situations like environments like the ones that all of you here work in, where you're constantly surrounded by trauma, lack of resources, feeling like you don't have, and you really don't, have the skills or the support to fix everything for everyone. It's really easy to get cynical. It's really easy to feel hopeless. And so that's why reframing hope as a skill and not a feeling is really important. And this is a concept that comes from work at George Washington University, where as a resident, I learned a type of therapy or a type of technique called the hope modules, where instead of asking patients about if they were feeling hopeful, instead, I would inquire about, when you feel hopeless, when you feel cynical, what do you do? Which skill do you employ? Do you reach out to friends? Do you lean on your relationships? Do you move into problem solving mode and figure out strategies? Do you employ emotion regulation? Are you someone who will turn to like a breathing exercise? Maybe you really like doing sensory stuff, gardening, coloring books, things like that. Or maybe you turn to your faith community, right? Maybe it's your church or your spiritual group that gives you a connection to meaning, right? We all have those skills that we employ. It's just about naming them and understanding that that's a process. That's something that you have to keep consistently doing, and not just waiting to feel hopeful as a feeling. I'm going to skip Imagine Your Chessboard, and we can get to that during our time together for discussion. So let me stop here and open it up for questions. And then after questions, we'll take a little break. I will say that there's a bunch of ways to go deeper and learn more. We're going to have another session later in June that's going to dive into the Real Self-Care Compass. I do have an email list that's free. It's called Therapy Takeaway. And then my book also is available. There's also an audiobook if you like to listen to your books. And my company is Gemma Women, and we have a whole bunch of women's mental health courses that are all digital. So let me stop sharing and take a look at questions.
Feel free to put questions in the chat or to raise your hand or unmute, come out, say it out loud.
Okay, let's see. So there's a question from Megan. Do you have suggestions for setting boundaries when we're working or living in situations that will punish us for doing so? Yes, that is a great question. Megan, would you feel comfortable sharing a little bit more about what feels hard about that and clarifying what you mean by punish?
I'm thinking about a work situation that I've been in, where I have set a boundary for an opportunity that I was given. And then after that, like, I no longer was looked to as a person with a leadership role. They automatically went to other people. When at that moment it wasn't the right time, but later it could have been. And that opportunity was gone for years because I said no at this one time. And felt like I was kind of written off as like not a team player and not willing to sacrifice things like that because I had set some boundaries in my life.
Thank you for sharing. Have you noticed that happen to other people in the same system, or are you the only one that's happened to?
No,
Yeah.
it's me too. It's the system is not set up for people who set boundaries. So
Yep. Okay. So so my suggestion there is, from what I've seen, every system that I've worked in punishes people that set boundaries. I've never actually worked in a system that did not, where that was not the case. It was, the differentiator was the degree of punishment. So one, and that means that the system is sick, right? And this is why I say that the work environments that all of you are in are quite similar to healthcare environments, because healthcare has a very similar sickness as the education system and the childcare system. So I think you have to, so I think in real time, if we go back in time, so yeah, two pieces, there's like back in time and then there's now. So if we go back in time, that's why the pause is something that I always come back to, because the no, right? The boundary isn't a no, the boundary is the pause. And then you do the calculus for yourself on the yes, no, negotiate. That does mean that you have to really know yourself and know what your priorities are. And also know that, yeah, there's always going to be a cost, right? And like, can I bear that cost? And you might not, depending on how new you are to that system, and if you know all the players and how well you know them, and the politics and all this stuff, you might not be able to totally predict what the cost will be. Like, there's always going to be a learning curve with that. And that's just the game, right? I don't know that we can do anything about that. But what I would say, in that space, in that present tense, is for those who are maybe on the call and in one of those spaces right now, is to try and like keep some form of like log or notes for yourself of like, when you do set a boundary, and you do pause, and like the different grades of the pause, and like if you ever do say no, or maybe you don't say no, but instead there's a request or an opportunity, and instead of saying yes right away, your first response is to ask a question. That's another form of a boundary, right? Not an immediate yes, but asking a question. Like, how is that received, right? Do you notice that they're kind of like, yeah, okay, well, right? That tells you some information. Keeping some form of, for yourself, just like some journaling around that, some notes around that. So you can, as you're planning and strategizing for what you want and where you want to go, what you want to do, if you want to stay here, go somewhere else, all these big decisions, that you can come back to remember that. Because, we're all so busy. It's so hard to keep track. You forget. I mean, gosh, I can't even remember like what happened last week, let alone like 2 months ago. So that's like that kind of like record keeping is really important. And then I would say for where you are right now, Megan, don't beat yourself up, right? Because you had that was an instinct for you, right? And that's important. Like it's really easy to what's the phrase? Monday morning quarterback and kind of be like, oh, I should have gotten that, right? If I would have said yes, or if I would have been more agreeable or acquiesced, XYZ could have happened. You don't know that. You also don't know, you could have said yes, and it could have led to even more burnout and like other, terrible interpersonal things. So there was a reason that you decided to set a boundary there. And I would just, give yourself some grace that there was something in you that was coming out and needed to take that risk, and that the cost was worth it. Is that helpful? Hopefully that's helpful.
It is. And I'm wondering if I can ask a little follow-up then. So now, the position that I have now, I get to kind of facilitate some other adults at work. And so I'm wondering how to interrupt that, where I'm still involved in the system, but I don't want to perpetuate these feelings. I want to like have people set boundaries that are right for them and all of that. So do you have advice on kind of interrupting those systemic problems that we have? Where, I don't run a business. I can't just decide for myself. I still work within a system. How do we kind of make that work?
Yeah. So what I've seen is that transparency goes a really long way. So the people that you're working with know that you're still in the system. You get a paycheck inside the system, right? So they're not expecting you to like be able to overthrow the man and, take it all down, right? But what you can model is, because so often in these systems, nobody speaks truth, right? It's all like kind of a runaround. So you being somebody who's transparent and being direct with people of like, oh, well, this is where my hands are tied. Like, this is totally like a budget thing, but here is what I can do, or we can do, or here's the place where there is wiggle room, or here's the person that you need to convince, because that's the person that holds the purse strings. Like that type of real talk, I think goes a really long way, and people, it's refreshing, and it helps not only people above you, but also new people, junior people. It helps them be able to navigate the systemic constraints too. And then the other thing that I would say is modeling your own boundaries and your own intention setting and value keeping. So I've been living this myself with my book tour. My book came out in March, and I have been talking honestly about how I've been basically almost burnt out with going through it and to interviews and all these things. And now I've been responding to my emails because I decided that June and July were going to be slower for me. And so I've just been responding to emails and saying, I'm in a time of rest. I'm like going internal. And so I'm not going to be able to, I have to say no. And people have been very gracious in their responses. And so I think that for you, if you're in a position of leadership, you should be the person who then is like, no, I'm not, whatever your setup is. But if the setup is like, I'm off on the weekends, I don't check my email on the weekends, I don't expect you guys to check your email on the weekends, then you should live that too. And that gives them permission. I once had a boss who bragged about having a sleeping bag under her desk. Like, that's not helping anybody. Okay, let's see. So we got another question. I think it's from Jasmine. Laura and Kiki, is it okay if we just dive deep into these questions? Okay, great. What about if there's a mismatch between your definition of good enough and the person on the receiving end's version of good enough? It's not good by their standards. How do you get to a middle ground? FYI, I'm not in a space where I can talk at the moment. Okay. Yes. I'm assuming that this question has to do with like personal relationships, potentially like a life partner or a co-parent or something like that, somebody that you live with. And so my answer, the first part of the answer is that this is hard, but not impossible. And that when there's a mismatch in the definition of good enough, that means that you have to go a couple layers deeper. Because you might be arguing or in conflict about, how clean the house is, or like what is like an adequate dinner, or like the laundry, or like this type of stuff. And it's like, it's not actually about that at that level. It's actually about the communication between two people. And the goal is not for one person to be right and the other person to be wrong. The goal is to get to a place of feeling like you're on the same team and you're working together for a solution of good enough that is co-created and is acceptable for everybody. There's a great book by a friend of mine, Eve Rodsky. It's called Fair Play. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. She talks about the minimal viable, I think it's the minimal standard of operation. So like, what's the minimum that can be done for a certain domestic task? And that both, if there's two parents in a household, that there needs to be sort of agreement on what is the minimum viable labor for any number of tasks. But underneath that, like that's kind of like the operations level. And then underneath that, you are going to find that there might be childhood stuff under there. Like maybe one person really grew up in poverty, and like having a dirty house, like a quote unquote dirty house, reminds them of the fact that, they had a single mom who couldn't pay the bills and had to work 4 jobs. And they always were ashamed to, I'm making this up, but they felt ashamed to have friends over because they felt like their house was always not as clean as they wanted it to be. And so now when there's clutter all over the bedroom, they lose their shit because it's triggering something from a long time ago. So this answer, so then for your, like, the solve for this means that it's not going to be one conversation. It needs to actually be a series of pretty gentle conversations, like not coming at it from like, you're wrong and I'm right, and like, you're being unreasonable and like, this is ridiculous, right? But more just like, okay, like we need to like sit down and like really give ourselves some space and some time to talk through what's going on here. And like clear, and like, I have a sense that even though on the surface we're talking about dinner, that actually we're talking about a bunch of other stuff too. And I want to make the space for us to find a way to come together on that and really understand like where you're coming from. So you want to turn up the curiosity. Again, you want to be gentle and not attacking or accusatory. Yes, I like the school examples. Scribbled notes for a lesson plan versus the fully written out teacher versus super ideal versus realistic. Okay, so that's actually a little different. I was just giving you guys like a couples therapy session, but I would say if it's actually more of a workplace example, then I think it's about time and unreasonable expectations of how much time you have and how much labor they're expecting, unpaid labor, they're expecting you to be able to squeeze in. So then I think what you need to do is you have to sort of line item it. Like you have to have a spreadsheet of like, okay, this is how long each of these things take. And here's like my 1 hour planning period where I have 60 minutes. And for me to do like a full lesson plan that has like PowerPoint slides, I don't know how you guys do lesson plans, but I'm imagining like, right, like if this person wants like PowerPoint, it wants visuals, wants XYZ, then I would write it out in a very, right, what would you like for me to prioritize? Here's the timestamps of what each thing takes and make it like excruciatingly detailed, like here's how long it take, 20 minutes for me to research this thing, right? 20 minutes for me to write the editorial, write the copy, 30 minutes for me to lay it all out in a PowerPoint deck, right? And then take that to that person and ask what the priority is in a 60-minute time span. So then you're sort of forcing their hand and you're asking them to really see how much time each of these things takes. Yes, language access. That's even more time consuming. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so let's see from Siobhan. How would you suggest navigating scenarios where another person's boundary makes it challenging for you to maintain your own? I do have a follow-up question. Is the other person's boundary, does the other person's boundary make it challenging for you to maintain your own, or is it the way that they express the boundary that makes it challenging?
Yeah, and maybe it's more overall, right? Like we're talking about how the systems itself create opportunities for failure, right? Like if everyone is not set up to be successful, then by someone establishing their boundary, for example, nope, I'm not able to come in and help you. I can't do that. And so now you are in a bind and you're like, dang, I really need this support. Like I'm trying to establish and maintain that this is something in order for my, holistic wellness. I need to make sure that I have the support that I need or what have you, and how to navigate that space when you want to be firm in your own boundaries, but you also are either being asked to have something accomplished, or you need to have something done, or it's maybe in your site or your school or what have you. Just curious how to like navigate those challenging conversations where you're hoping for support and maybe it's not being offered.
Right. And this is sort of when you're like in a leadership position to a little bit, or like you're managing others, or everyone's in the same place.
Yeah, I could either be managing and supervising or at the peer level.
Yeah. Yeah. So so I would think about this in terms of interconnectivity. So that if you're in a system and actually working with other people, that this is going to happen all the time, right? Like it should actually be happening all the time. So it's not, I would resist the urge to internalize it and make it a failure on your part that people are saying no to you, and instead think of it as, okay, like this is a place where people feel safe. People do feel safe saying no to me, and that's a good thing. I also would think about time and urgency, and like if you're getting no's and you find yourself getting like really angry or irritable, that is a sign that your cup is really, really empty. And like your work responsibilities, or like these things that you're trying to organize that people are saying no to, that can't be your respite, right? Like your respite has to be something else. So if getting those boundaries is kind of triggering this a little bit of like a martyr feeling, then that's a data point for you that something is a little bit off in the way. Either you don't have enough institutional support or resources, right? And so then you need to be kind of going up the ladder a little bit more. Or there's other areas like outside of work that you could be taking, putting more time into things that would really be nourishing. So then you don't feel so like brittle around when something isn't held. I'm trying to think if there's anything else on that question.
No, it's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that learning to receive the no's and the boundaries is a really important piece of the whole equation, right? Because we are talking about like culture change and changing systems. And what I suspect in this situation is that if it feels so depleting for you, that means that you're not getting enough from the top. And there's probably too much on well, of course, there's too much on all of your shoulders, but that's probably a piece of it too. So maybe that means that whatever this project is, maybe it should be simplified, or like not as extensive as it is, because there's actually not enough institutional resources for it to have that much coordination, or like all the stuff that it sounds like you're having to orchestrate. Let me just see if there's anything here else.
While Dr. Lakshmin's looking through the chat, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming today. Kiki put some links in the chat for our evaluation forms. You can share any feedback. We love to hear any feedback you have. And then some links to connect with ELSI. We organize this, as well as all of Dr. Lakshmin's social media and whatnot. So I want to respect everyone's time, but we might stay on for a couple minutes if there are any last thoughts. But I also want to let our interpreter go home. Rest the brain.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for having me. This was such a pleasure. It was a great conversation, and I hope that all of you got something out of the presentation. And there is a takeaway. It's called the Real Self-Care Thermometer. It is a little PDF quiz that I think we will send out over email. It's an excerpt from the book. It's a nice little tool to assess how you're doing with boundaries. And yeah, I hope to see some of you at the last session in June too, to kind of dive deeper.
Thank you so much.